agreed with me. I couldn't see how Catholics could possibly spend any time reading the Bible and still believe what they believe. It just was, there were too many areas where, to me, it didn't seem like the two things went together.
You were beginning with the presupposition, and that is,
right.
Show it to me here.
Right. I was starting with that presupposition. Everything that I need to know is in Scripture, and if it's not in Scripture, I can't trust it. If it's a trustworthy doctrine that I'm supposed to believe, it will be found in Scripture. That's the presupposition.
Then you described that in seminary you started encountering scriptures that we couldn't explain themselves, a variety of ones. And name another one if you can remember that.
Well, let me give you maybe even a bigger turning point in my life. Just a few years ago, I did what a lot of evangelicals do. I decided at the beginning of the year to read the whole book, the whole Bible through by the end of the year. I started in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and started working through Numbers, which is a tough one, but I kept going. And I got to about the minor prophets. I worked through all the poetry, I worked through all the history, and I remember it was like a bolt of lightning one day. I realized that there wasn't enough stuff in the Old Testament to do a sin offering. There wasn't enough information in the Bible, in the Old Testament, to be a good Jew in the Old Testament. And I realized that there had to be a tradition that was passed down from this priest to the next generation of priests that was never written down in Scripture. That there had to be this oral tradition. Well, I knew where that was leading, and I didn't like it.
You knew where it was leading?
I knew.
Did you? That's I'm wondering how the Catholic Church even came into the picture.
Well, I still wasn't thinking about being a Catholic. Basically, I had to teach that next Sunday at the church. I had an adult class every Sunday that I taught. So I did what every good Bible teacher does when they come across an insight that they don't know how to incorporate into what they did. I ignored it. I wish I could tell you that very week I sat down and tried to figure out how to fit that in. But it was so disruptive that I put it on the back burner. I couldn't think about it for a little while. But that prepared me for when I got into the New Testament, not in that same reading, but a couple years later I started to realize that Sola Scriptura is never taught in the New Testament. And it's a logical problem, because it's like the person that says all generalizations are false. Well, that in itself is a generalization. And I realized that if I was saying I could only trust what was in the Bible, but that statement wasn't in the Bible, then I was in trouble. And I realized that that is what made me realize I could not be a Protestant anymore.
It makes me wonder if you ended up in that no man's land position that so many end up in. You can't be a Protestant, but can you be, of all things? And what got you interested in the Catholic
Well,
faith?
at the same time then, I was doing a lot of research. By the time I was to this point, I was starting to realize that I was going someplace, and I wanted to get into control of where I was going. I didn't know where this was leading me, but I wanted to get in the driver's seat. So I started to study the Eucharist, and Sola Scriptura is the doctrine that drove me out of the Protestant church. The Eucharist is what made me fall in love with the Catholic Church. And when I saw how clearly it was taught in Scripture, I look back and I still am amazed that I never saw the Eucharist. But the Eucharist is what drew me to the church. But Sola Scriptura was what I said, I can't stay here. I cannot be a Protestant anymore because this is just not logically possible.
Well, how did that journey then come to fruition?
Well, obviously, a lot of this was reading, which you do alone. And actually, I didn't really meet any Catholics that were really on-fire Catholics, loyal Catholics, to talk to until after I'd already decided to become a Catholic. So it was sort of my wife and myself, and she has a good background, going to Wheaton, and she went to Trinity. And so we would sit down and talk these things over. And I'd say, well, honey, how do you deal with this verse? Because I was starting to see all these verses through the eyes of the church. And all of a sudden, these problem verses that I've been carrying around for 10 years, in my knapsack, waiting for an answer to, they were all being answered. And she would say, well, boy, Dave, that sounds Catholic. And I'd say, yeah, it sounds Catholic to me, too. And one by one, I realized that I couldn't make this decision and ever go back. I realized that if I ever became a Catholic, it was going to be forever. So we very carefully, systematically went through every doctrine of the church that we could think of, that we could find in any book. We studied them all, and I came in the end to say, I can give my, seal of belief to every single one of them.
It's amazing that your wife was walking right along with you on that. What a
Yeah,
grace.
yeah, it was grace. In fact, I look back and it's the grace of God that, first of all, she and I were able to come into the church together. And then all 6 of our children came into the church on the exact same day with us. My oldest was 14 at the time, which, as you know, by the time they're 14, I have a 14-year-old, a 12-year-old, 10-year-old. Any one of those could have said, no, I'd like the youth group over at the Baptist church. They were leaving their friends as well.
Yeah, it brings a lot. We'll talk about that later, because it does bring up the issue of family struggles when you make this big division. Let's go back to the topic and hand a little bit. Now, Sola Scriptura, meaning the Bible alone, as the foundation for all we believe. How and where did this idea, it's a big question, but where did it ever come about?
Well, I'm not an expert on church history, but from what I can tell is as the reformers and the pre-reformers, such as John Huss and Wycliffe, were unhappy with things in the church, and some of it was justified that they were unhappy with in the church of their day. They were sort of seeking for another authority, because obviously in the religious life you have to have an authority. That's by definition part of it. And when you take away the church and you take away the magisterium and you take away tradition, basically all that's left is, unless you want a totally individualistic faith, is the Bible. So they, in my opinion, they sort of latched onto this, which for at least 12 centuries no one had ever done.
At least from that individualist, Bible alone. And really, when you look at it, it comes from a deep devotion to the Word of God.
Exactly.
And a love for Jesus Christ. And we
very good intentions.
Yes, good intentions, but a limited, and sadly then a kind of myopic look at how do you define what's true.
And the irony of it, Marcus, is that so many of these churches are trying to be like the early church. They want to recreate the New Testament church. And the irony of it is the New Testament church didn't have this Bible.
Yeah, right, right.
All they had was the apostles' teaching. They had the tradition, and not the written word. And yet, when people go back and try to recreate that church, they do it on the basis of what they see in a book that those people didn't have.
The search for going back to the early church. We need a teacher to help us to understand how to use the writings of the early church, because I've heard it recently described that going back to the early church is like saying, I don't like this oak tree, I want to go back to the acorn. And you miss the whole growth, the development that the Spirit has done for 100 years. And that's too often we're going back to early church.